All right, and we
All
are
right.
live.
All right, well, welcome everyone to My Financial Coach's quarterly economic update with Dr. Arthur Laffer. Before we get started with the program today, what I'd like to do is just give you another high-level overview of some of the things that we're doing at My Financial Coach. And then we're going to have our subject matter expert talk about items that are timely today. And then, of course, we'll hear from Dr. Laffer. Ampo, can you put up the slides? Yeah, good. So what I wanted to do today is to give you a little overview of the concept behind My Financial Coach. A number of us a few years ago got together, and what we wanted to do was to create unbiased and unconflicted financial planning advice. You know, today you can get financial planning from most financial service organizations. However, most are selling a product or a service. We wanted unbiased and unconflicted advice, so we put My Financial Coach together. As many of you know, we have certified financial planners. We're all fiduciaries and work with each of our clients. We have individuals, corporate executives, physicians, dental practices, and business owners, providing unbiased and unconflicted advice, helping them with their overall financial plan. When we run into any issues, and if the individual doesn't have a current advisor, we're using a number of subject matter experts, a few you'll hear from today, that we have vetted out that bring certain expertise to the table, and we've had tremendous success with it. Next slide. Next slide. So the issue that we're trying to solve is that most employers don't have a cost-effective financial wellness solution for their key employees within the organization. Currently, programs are too costly for most organizations, especially mid-market organizations or say physician practices, et cetera. So we wanted to bring that price point down and again, provide that financial planning. And we're able to do that because of our technology platform. And again, because of our certified financial planners, who are all fiduciaries and salaried employees. Next slide. So what we do is we take a look at everything that you're doing on the left-hand side here, all of your employer benefits, your personal accounts, your stock accounts, your life insurance, your home values, et cetera. And we try to aggregate those all on one secured platform and then bring that advice. The problem is on the right-hand side that most advisors who, again, have a conflict that they're either trying to manage money or provide insurance solutions really don't have the bandwidth to focus on the total financial plan and all the elements required. And they don't have a good knowledge of some of these corporate benefits. Again, that's the solution that we're trying to bring to the table here. Next slide. So we provide ongoing assistance. So not only do we look at all of the elements of financial planning, deep into cash flow management, budgeting, retirement planning, estate planning, and so forth, we have a number of subject matter experts in tax, legal, accounting, insurance, investments, and so forth, again, that we can lean on when advice is needed. You can take all the slides down, Ampo. So what I'd like to do next is talk about a couple high level, at a very high level, a couple topics that have come up. And I've asked two of our subject matter experts to speak today. Lamar Brashears, who's the CEO of Harding Financial Partners. This is a full service wealth management organization that works with dentists, physicians, business owners, corporate executives, and individuals. He brings a lot of experience to the table. And recently, we worked on a project together with a high-level corporate executive who was facing an issue with their non-qualified executive benefit plans. And as most of you know that have a knowledge of these deferred comp arrangements, know that there's not a lot of flexibility. So it really took some creativity on Lamar's part to really think through the issues that the individual was trying to accomplish and bring a solution to the table. With that, Lamar.
Hey, Bill, I appreciate the nice introduction. Thank you.
So what we're going to go over just in the next 5 to 7 minutes is a very high level overview of what non-qualified deferred compensation is, some of the restrictions that employees who have non-qualified deferred compensation have with regards to their distributions, come up with one solution that we used with an executive that you can apply to your clients, and then also go over what the results are of implementing that solution going forward. So let's take a look just at what is non-qualified deferred compensation. And it's very simple. An employee defers a portion of their income into an employer's deferred compensation plan. And by doing that, they reduce their current taxable income. So they reduce their AGI. Now, at that point, the corporation owes that employee that compensation at a later date, usually at retirement. And when that employee retires or decides to terminate employment, they have several options on taking out that deferred compensation from the plan. And with this solution right here, what we're trying to do is not say this is the absolute best way to exit a deferred compensation plan, but because of the distribution restrictions that employee faces with that account, to give them alternative planning opportunities with regards to income and estate tax planning. So again, we're not saying this is the best thing, for everybody, but in certain situations, they will need that additional planning flexibility. So let's take a look at what some of those restrictions are on those distributions. For those of you who are financial planners, you'll recognize the term IRS Reg 409 Alpha or 409A. We've been dealing with that for several years now, but what that did was, with respect to non-qualified deferred compensation plans, it did give some restrictions. So what we see currently, and especially just with the example that Bill mentioned that we did in 2020, 2021, they elected to take a lump sum distribution at retirement. Now, if an employee does not want to take their entire account distributed at retirement, they are allowed to redefer those distributions in 5-year increments. And the issue that creates for most employees, though, and the reason they take that lump sum at retirement, is that when that employee retires and they further defer their distributions from the account, that account is still subject and liable to the creditors of the corporation. So if that corporation gets in financial trouble and creditors come after that corporation, that employee runs the risk of losing their retirement account, their deferred compensation account. So what we see in real life is that most employees take that lump sum distribution right at retirement. So with that in mind, let's go to just talking about the solution, and then we'll get into what that solution provides for the employee. So remember, our objective in this plan is to give that employee who has a non-qualified deferred compensation account, and give them planning alternatives that give them additional flexibility with regards to taxable income in retirement, as well as flexibility with their estate tax planning. So this planning solution comes in 2 parts. There is the pre-retirement planning, typically 2 to 10 years before the planned retirement date for that employee. And then once the employee retires, there's the post-retirement execution of this solution. So here's what we do. We have that employee or that executive take out an index universal life insurance policy. So this is an insurance-based solution. But that policy is paid for with a bank loan that we secure on behalf of the employee. So the index universal life policy is taken out and it's funded with a bank loan. And that bank loan payoff is deferred typically about 10 years. So we have the bank loan, we fund the life insurance policy, the policy begins to earn interest. That cash value begins to earn interest, and the payoff of that bank loan is deferred to a later date. Now, when that employee retires, the non-qualified deferred compensation plan, at that point, we'll distribute that account to the employer, the executive. Taxes will be paid, and we use the remaining post-tax lump sum to pay off that bank loan on the life insurance policy. So at retirement, what the employee is left with, without any risk of IRS audit, is a life insurance policy that is fully funded, and the cash value in that policy can grow tax-free and be potentially distributed tax-free through the use of policy loans. So we're left with this life insurance policy with its tax-free growth potential and tax-free withdrawal potential. But let's talk about the results that this gives for the employee from an income and estate tax planning perspective. On the estate planning side at this point, the employee has a very large death benefit. So if they pass away unexpectedly, let's say a car accident or something like that, their family will receive that tax-free death benefit. Additionally, most modern index universal life policies have what's called an accelerated death benefit built in at no additional cost to help pay for medical expenses while that employee is still alive, so they can access the death benefit while they're alive. So from an estate planning standpoint, we've improved their situation with the life insurance policy. From an asset protection standpoint, and fully understanding that, if they had not done the solution, they can take that lump sum and put it into a trust or something like that for asset protection. But under this solution, the remaining funds have state and federal protection. One, most states protect the cash value of the life insurance policy from bankruptcies and creditors. Additionally, if you take that life policy and place it into an irrevocable life insurance trust, that gives you additional asset protection. From a retirement income standpoint, one of the advantages of an indexed universal life policy is that the interest credited is based on the performance of an index, such as the S&P 500. If the S&P 500 goes negative, there is a zero floor, meaning that the client or the employee will not lose interest due to a market crash. So from a retirement income standpoint, they do have that market protection against loss. The cash inside the policy at that point, the cash value can grow tax deferred and be withdrawn tax-free via policy loans. And instead of if an employee does not want to take that lump sum distribution at retirement, now they have the option where this life insurance policy gives them the flexibility to take out the amount that they want when they want, without having to worry about the creditors of their former employer coming after their account. So when we're looking at income and estate planning flexibility, we've achieved that. Let's take a look at this next slide, where we go over just a real world example. So we executed this for an employee of a public company, and we calculated it out, gave a side-by-side example. And if you look at what his distributions would have been through the non-qualified deferred compensation account at $619,514 versus what this life policy would have put out tax-free through policy loans, you can see there's a difference of about $130,000 a year for 10 years. Additionally, there was a death benefit left over. So if you look at the far right-hand side, you can see that remaining death benefit after those tax-free distributions come out. So again, this is not the end-all be-all for non-qualified deferred compensation exits, but it is a solution that gives clients some additional benefits and flexibility. So, Poe, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lamar. Again, this is a situation where we found an issue that a client had, and they were looking for some alternatives, and Lamar has come in with a solution that actually enhanced this executive situation. So it brings us to kind of the main event, as they say in boxing, right, Dr. Laffer?
Get ready to rumble!
Gives me a pleasure to introduce my friend, fellow shareholder here at My Financial Coach, and the father of supply side economics, Dr. Arthur Laffer, who's worked with many presidents, both sides of the aisle, worked with countries around the world on tax policy, worked all the way back to Margaret Thatcher, and has accomplished many, many things, as many of you know, in his career. He worked recently on the tax bill under President Trump and actually received the Presidential Medal of Freedom at the White House a few years ago. We all know him from his work with Ronald Reagan, tax policy, helping California reduce our real estate taxes before I left the great state of California. But those survivors are enjoying Prop 13 back there. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Arthur Laffer.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Now, are you going to do an interview type of discussion today, or how do you want to handle this?
No, I'd like maybe for you to talk about what's going on today in the economy, what's happening there in Washington, and how is this all going to impact us? And then give us a little insight on the book that you're finishing also on tax.
Sure, I'd love to. Then let me do that. By the way, I just love Lamar's presentation. If you remember, Bill Elliott, long time ago and far away, you were able to get the protections there for Bill, if you remember, from the lawsuits and bankruptcy that the company faced, and you were able to save him a lot. And it sounds like Lamar is providing something very similar to that for companies. It's just very impressive. Let me, if I can, start just by talking about today. Today, there are 4 million fewer people working in the United States, employed today in the United States, than there were in February of 2020. So you've got, what is it, a year and 9 months later, and there are 4 million people fewer working today. The population of the United States is up by 2.2 million in that same period of time. Today, real GDP, the total production of goods and services, is much lower today than it was pre-COVID, taking a trend line. So we are below the trend line substantially, and there's very little evidence that we're catching up to that trend line. So we are not coming close to coming back to our pre-COVID levels with the trend. That's just not happening. And we're way below. When you think of 4 million jobs less than there were a year and 10 months ago, that's pretty shocking. GDP growth in the latest period was about 2%, which means that GDP growth is below where it would have to be able to catch up to our pre-COVID trend line. It's just not happening. What you find today is monetary policy has eliminated all reserve requirements. We have probably more member deposits at the Federal Reserve than ever before, which means there is almost no facility there which allows the Fed to ever contract the monetary base to bring the reins back on money as a means of controlling inflation. Now, as you know, we've had huge amounts of government spending during this period, much of it in the form of transfers, and not only transfers to the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised, the undereducated, but it's transfers to companies, forgiveness of PPP loans, and all sorts of other things, Bill, that you know about there. So these transfers have accrued all the way across the spectrum of the U.S. economy. Now, when these transfers occur, what happens is those people who receive the transfers have a lot of their financial imperative removed, and so they don't feel pressured that they have to work in order to live, to feed their families, etc. And a lot of these people don't have good jobs. They don't have jobs they like. So what you find happening is all of these transfers have provided people with the wherewithal so they can leave the labor force, which is exactly what has happened. They have left the labor force basically in the lowest rungs of the labor force, the low-income workers, the workers at Walmart, the fast foods, restaurants, other jobs that aren't all the most wonderful jobs in the world. And with the wherewithal being provided by the government, these people have left those jobs. The way you can tell it is those people, and not generally across the whole economy, is that GDP growth has declined far less than has employment growth, as employment has dropped, which means that there's a lot larger drop in employment than there has been in GDP, which means that these people are on the very low end of the contributions to GDP, which has happened disproportionately there. Now, let me, if I can, when you give all those transfers to people and they now feel much better off than they were before because of government transfers, they not only quit their jobs, that does reduce output, employment, production. But by giving them all these transfers, they now have the wherewithal to buy goods and services, and you find them increasing demand. So you have two things coming on with all this government spending and transfers. Number one, you have the withdrawal from the labor force. Number two, you have these people having large amounts of purchasing power, which they then do to buy goods and services. So you have a classic increase in the demand for goods and services because of the transfer. And you have a classic example of, because of the transfers, you have a reduction in the supply of goods and services with greater demand and less supplies, Bill. What you find happening is that inflation goes up. And I don't know if any of you've noticed, but the latest inflation numbers are up just a little bit. Just joking, they're up the largest amount we've had in years and years and years, probably since the early 1980s. We've had just a phenomenal surge in inflation, exactly what you'd expect from these types of ill-considered government spending programs. Not only do you find the increase in demand and the reduction of supply leading to higher prices, but it also leads to a huge influx of imports coming into the U.S. Those imports have clogged the harbors of LA and San Pedro and other West Coast harbors as well. So you have a supply chain problem and ships out in the ocean loaded with cargo, but they can't make it in yet, all because of the imbalance between demand and supply because of the transfers there that have occurred. Not only that, but you find immigration on the southern border. Lots of people have moved in to get immigration, to get the freebies that have been gotten by other people. So this is the circumstance you find yourself today. Much to my surprise, Joe Biden in Congress and the Democrats in Congress have proposed a very, very large additional transfer program, government spending program, a much larger one, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. It just would exacerbate the problems that we're talking about here. But they propose it. Now, right now, politically, that proposal has passed the House. It's being provided to the Senate on a reconciliation bill. That reconciliation bill in the Senate, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans in the Senate. The tie-breaking vote would be done by the Vice President, Kamala Harris. Were it to be 50-50, it is strictly along partisan lines. There are two Democrats for sure that are holding this bill up. Obviously, you all know Joe Manchin, and you know Kristen Sinema from Arizona are holding it up. I don't know what's going to happen to that bill. They've pared it down quite substantially, but then when it went back to the House to come to the Senate, the House grounded back up again. So there are lots of things that are going on in the Senate right now to pare down the tax increases. That's where Sinema's really pushing, and to pare down some of the other spending programs. That's where Manchin is working heavily. But I don't know how this thing's going to come out. It's been delayed and delayed and delayed. My best guess, if it's delayed beyond Christmas, which is a good shot that it will be delayed beyond Christmas, it will have to wait to the new year. And then once you start getting into the new year, you get into a very good big political season. And that political season would put my odds, and I'm just guessing. No, I'm not guessing. I'm just quoting other people who have guessed. I don't really have a knowledge of it myself, but just quoting other people whom I basically trust. There's a 50-50 chance that bill will not make it through. If it does make it through, I think it will be sharply reduced in the programs that are put in. They put in everything in there, plus the kitchen sink. I don't know of anything in this bill that I would consider positive in the slightest. Now, there is one thing that President Biden has done that I really fully support. I'm really very pleased of his executive order reinforcing Trump's executive order on medical transparency, where hospitals and medical services have to tell you what the price is ahead of time. And then there's no surprise billing. You get to buy it. There's quality that's been put through as well, so that you know not only what the price of the procedure is, but you also know what the historical quality of that procedure is. And you also know something about the doctor who would be providing that procedure, so that you can get a good guess as to what the outcomes might be for you. But that's where we are now. The political ramifications of 2022, and again, This is not my expertise, but it's extremely important. So I'm going to quote from people, paraphrase from a lot of people. The arguments are that the Republicans have a good chance of picking up the House next year. Some of the people are arguing that it could be as many as 30 seats, maybe even 40 seats. And the Senate, some people are arguing that we could even not lose the Senate. Next year, as you know, there's in 2022, there's a preponderance of Republican seats coming up for re-election in the Senate. That would mean that we would generally expect to lose seats in the Senate. But there are some people saying that the Republicans could even pick up 1, 2, or maybe even 3 seats and get control of the Senate. If the Republicans do get control of the Senate and the House, all of this stuff will stop. So here's where we are in the process. We're in a political conundrum right now with tax increases being provided in the bill and also more stimulus spending being there, which would exacerbate the employment problems, would exacerbate the inflation problems, would exacerbate the supply chain problems, and also would exacerbate the immigration problems that we're facing. I think this bill is one of the worst bills that we've ever seen coming through. That's where I'm coming out on the economy right as we speak today. On the book, which has just been signed up, we've got a publisher. We should have the book out in March or April. It goes through the whole history of the U.S. income tax, starting in 1913 and goes all the way through Trump on that. What it does is it outlines each of the period, and the lesson from the book is very clearly, whenever you raise, and it focuses very heavily on tax rates on the rich. Whenever you raise tax rates on the rich, it is very clear. I mean, throughout the entire 110 years of the income tax, whenever you raise tax rates on the rich, and by that I mean the top 1% of income earners, whenever you do that, the top 1% are hurt and their real incomes are reduced. That's true. It's also true that what they do earn, when you raise tax rates on the rich, their incomes are reduced, really reduced, but what they do earn, they shelter. So 2 effects occur, is that the effect is, 1, it hurts the rich, and it also causes the rich to shelter their income much more, much like what we're talking about here today. And that sheltering and the reduction in income causes a very sharp drop in reported incomes from the top 1%. Clearly does. Number 2, what you find there is when you raise tax rates on the rich, almost always, in fact, literally always, you find the economy underperforming, whether it be in the World War I period, in 1915, the highest marginal income tax rate in the US was 7%. By 1918, they had raised that highest rate to 77%. That was a terrible period for the welfare of the US economy during that period. After 1918, with 77%, the rate was dropped to 73% under Woodrow Wilson. Then we had the election of 1920, where the Republicans had the largest victory ever in US history, with Harding and Coolidge defeating Cox and Roosevelt. Landslide victory for Harding and Coolidge. They then started to drop the tax rates. There was a huge recession immediately following the election before they were able to drop those tax rates. Then they dropped the tax rates down to the 1920s. I don't know if you know what it was called, but it was called the Roaring 20s. Average incomes reported by the top 1% went through the ceiling. It was a very prosperous period. Then in 1929, the House passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was the largest increase in taxes on traded products in the history of the US. The market in 1929 dropped from its peak in September to the end of the year by 35%, 35%. In the next year, that market dropped additionally, so that the total drop in the stock market from the peak prior to the Smoot-Hawley passage by the House to the final passage by the Senate and signed into law by Herbert Hoover in June of 1930, the market dropped by 95%. So if your portfolio was worth $100, it's now worth $5. It was, the unemployment rate went up to 15, 20, 25% in this. In his infinite wisdom, Hoover raised the highest marginal income tax rate on January 1st, 1932. He raised it from 25% to 63%. He raised all sorts of other taxes too. That's just the illustration of how stupid he was. He did that. We went further into the deep recession. Roosevelt won the election. In 1933, in March, Roosevelt took office. He had a wealth tax placed on all gold holdings of Americans, made it illegal for Americans to hold gold. You have to turn in all specie gold and silver. It was a wealth tax. We bought the gold. The government bought the gold at $20.67 an ounce in March, and then revalued the price of gold to $35 an ounce in October, which is a massive wealth tax on the American people. He didn't raise the income tax again until 1937. He raised the income tax rate to 79%, and lots of other taxes too, a 25% per annum retained earnings tax on businesses. Then by 1945, we'd raised the tax to 94%. And I could keep on going, but the second, I'm just giving you an illustration of what's going on. The second important point, when you raise taxes on the rich, all right, the economy way underperforms. One, it hurts the rich and they shelter what they do earn. Number two, it hurts the economy. And number three, the primary victims of a bad economy and raising tax rates on the rich are the poor. The poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised, the illiterate. The unemployment rates during the 1930s went way, way up, just creaming the poor, the minorities. I mean, it just is such a tragedy, the consequences that befell the lowest echelons of the income ladder. It was just awful. In the wartime period, you look at consumption by man hours went up by something like 64% during the war. Participation rates rose, unemployment rates dropped. You had average hours go way, way, way up. And yet the consumption bundle for Americans stayed the same. Consumable real wages per hour went back to really 18th, 19th century levels. I mean, much lower than the Great Depression. It was a tragedy. All of this falling on the backs of the poor. Tax revenues, when you raise tax rates on the rich, tax revenues from the rich actually went down, but tax rates on the lowest incomes went way up. So you had a big skew there, where rich had paid something like 70% of all the taxes in 1928-29. The rich now dropped their share of total taxes way down, the poor did. And then you come to the period where, I usually stop here, take a deep breath, and sit there and look up at the sky, which is clouds parting, sun shining. Ronald Reagan comes in, it's amazing. From 1943 to 1981, average tax rate was about a little over 80%. Tax revenues grew at tax revenues from the top 1% grew at a little less than 1.5%. From 1981 to today, average tax rates were a little bit less than 40%. I think it was about 34% during that whole period. Tax revenues from the top 1% grew by more than 4% per annum. You had this tremendous prosperity. Tax revenues from the rich went way up. Tax revenues from the 95%, the bottom 95%, went down as a share of GDP. So this is the result. Now, the other three things that are true, obviously, if you lower tax rates from the rich, they report more of their income, they earn more income, and they pay more in taxes. If you lower tax rates, the economy prospers and does really well. If you lower tax rates, the specifically beneficiaries are the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised. And you see this clearly every which way, whether it be the Kennedy go-go 60s, the roaring 20s, whether you see the Great Depression, World War II, whether you see it, the big tax cuts after World War II and the boom in the US economy, and then Truman raising those tax rates back up to 91%, and Eisenhower having 3 recessions in the 8 years he's in office, then the cut in the tax rates with John F. Kennedy, the boom, the go-go 60s, then you have the horrible period, which I refer to as the Four Stooges, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, which is the largest assemblage of bipartisan ignorance probably ever put on planet Earth. And then you get the Reagan period of enormous prosperity growth, tremendous revenue increases from the super rich, and people stopped sheltering, they stopped doing all that stuff, especially the 86 Tax Act, which is just incredible. They dropped the highest marginal income tax rate in the 86 Act from 50% to 28%. They raised the lowest rate from 12.5% to 15%. We went from 11 tax brackets down to 2 tax brackets, 28 and 15. That was it. And the economy just flourished beyond belief. Revenues poured in. We cut the corporate rate from 46% to 34%. I mean, it was an amazing period of prosperity. So looking at all of this, the last chapter or two of this book sort of comes into the modern era of Obama and W, which I think they're the Bobbsey twins of ignorance. They just did very bad policies. Then you get the really wonderful but very short period of prosperity of Donald Trump. That tax bill did really well. We hit the lowest poverty rates ever recorded in U.S. history. We hit the lowest unemployment rate for Blacks, for Hispanics, for the illiterate. I mean, it's just an amazing thing. And tax revenues from the top one, tax revenues from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act, tax revenues in the 2 years following that were up substantially from what they were in the 2 years prior to that. In fact, they not only grew after the tax cut, they grew by more than they had grown in the prior 4 years to the prior 2 years. So this is the history of the U.S. thing. I think you'll love it. You'll see all the quotes, all the things there to people. You'll see all the arguments in this book. You'll see just how the politics played out. I mean, the one I just love telling the story about is the 86 Tax Act, which I was very, very involved with, Bill, as you know, with the president. That was sort of based on my the complete flat tax, which I did for Jerry Brown when he ran for president. But it was both Kemp Casson and Bradley Gephardt used my paper on that. The tax cut, the tax bill of 1986, again, we dropped the highest rate from 50% to 28. We dropped the corporate from 46 to 34. We went from 11 brackets to 2 brackets. We raised the lowest rate on the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised. And that bill passed the Senate, if you can believe it, by a vote of 97-3. Can you imagine anything like that being passed today? We are in a critical period right now of very, very hostile politics, much like it was after Nixon. And this hostile period really needs something to break the ice, to get things going. One side has to have a definitive victory over the other. I'm thinking that 2022 might just be that watershed where we really start the break with the silliness that's going on now. And it is strictly partisan, which is a clear sign that it's just absolute ignorance and hostility running everything in Washington. I'm going to stop there, but throw it open for questions if anyone has any.
That was very good. Ampo?
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining, and I am getting a few questions that are popping in the chat. So the first question that we have actually has to do with your insights on the proposed legislation that has just come down from the reconciliation bill. So that's kind of hot news right now. What are kind of some of the things that you either know about this bill or that you feel will either pass or not pass, or things of that nature?
Well, I don't know what the individual ones are now. I do know that Sinema is focusing very heavily on tax rates, highest tax rates especially, which is very impressive. She's talking about the corporate tax. She's talking about personal income taxes. I think she's also talking about capital gains taxes and some of the other unearned income taxes as well. In the process, Joe Manchin is talking much more about other features of the bill. Now, I don't know of anything that's broken in the last hour and a half or 2 hours. I haven't been following. You know, I have a flip phone, so I can't even follow Drudge. So, but let me just say, I don't know of anything there. But the battleground seems to be very much, can they do anything to swing these 2 senators into voting for it? And so far as I can see, they haven't done that yet. But Manchin is notorious for playing along, you know, holding back, and then finally breaking and voting with the Democrats on issues. I don't know Sinema personally, but she appears to be fairly principled in what she's doing on that. So I don't know how it's going to break, but you know, anything that bill passes, there is nothing in that bill that I think is worth anything. The numbers are totally misleading. For example, they have raising tax rates on the rich raising revenues over the next 10 years by huge amounts. They have hiring, putting in $85 billion into the IRS and hiring all sorts of more agents as raising tons and tons of revenues and having no negative effects on growth. I mean, all of this stuff makes no sense to anyone with a lick of sense. And when you look at these bills and you see how it happens and how many times it happens, it reminds me of the old Kentucky phrase, there ain't no lesson to be learned from the second kick of a mule. And anyone who allows them to get this kick is just ignorant of history, and people deserve the governments they get. So we're watching this, and then we'll watch the elections in November.
So speaking of kind of current era, there's a lot of talk about inflation, and one of the things that is happening right now is that inflation has traditionally been variable, of course, but during this period it has of course increased dramatically. What are your thoughts on what you expect inflation to look like for maybe the end of this year as well as next year, and the duration of that, and what do you see as some sort of strategy to protect yourself from that personally?
Yeah, as long as I'm not being paid to do this talk, I can say there's 100% money back guarantee on my statements. If I were paid anything, I would take that money back guarantee. We economists know very little about the origins of and the persistence of inflation. I wrote a piece in 1974 in the Wall Street Journal called The Bitter Fruits of Devaluation, where I go through why we're going to have double-digit inflation. I happened to be lucky and hit on it right on the spot. I got hostile letters from Milton Friedman, from Paul Samuelson, from all of these people. And then, of course, it came. Whenever you devalue your currency relative to a gold standard, especially, your prices will rise relative to the rest of the world's by the full amount of the devaluation. And the U.S. and a lot of these countries like Italy, et cetera, that devalued a lot more than the U.S., had much more inflation than Germany. That was a very explicit model of inflation that worked out almost precisely to the fifth decimal place. We are no longer on a gold standard. We no longer have an outside money system. We have an inside money system where the Federal Reserve buys all of the debt of the Treasury. They fund the deficit 100%, and they pay for it with opening up deposits held at the Fed by member banks. It's all an inside liability asset match precisely. They brought interest rates down to effectively as close to zero as you can get. So all of those monetary theories of inflation really don't hold. They just plain don't. You can see fiscal theories of inflation, which I described to you earlier with the transfers and the increase in demand, the reduction in supply of labor, all of that. Those are very crude, very broad brushed, very low information content theories of inflation as well. There are other theories of inflation that are also very weak, but let me describe them as well. There's the oil theory of inflation. When they shut down the Keystone pipeline, when we became very hostile to energy production, that has pushed up oil prices. And it is that key product inflation that sort of lets everything else adjust to it. There are tons and tons of inflation theories sitting out there. There's one that my student, Kathy Wood at ARC, I'm a little owner of ARC, a little bitty. I think I'm the only outside owner of ARC at all. But that she has that inflation is greatly impacted by technology increases, improvements. And she sees this huge sea of improvements out there where you get, for the same amount of inputs, you'll get much more output, or you'll get, for the same amount of output, you get a lot less inputs. That would imply a great reduction of inflation because of that. If you look at all these together, my sort of putting my arm around the trunks of the tree, and let me just tell you that Yellen and Powell have no more clue as to what causes inflation than the man on the moon, but that doesn't stop them from talking about it and saying it's going to. I believe, I'm personally of the view, very weakly held, again, no money back guarantee at all. My sort of sense of what's going on is that inflation is building into being a more permanent phenomenon. By more permanent, I mean it's here for a couple of years at least. And that's happening. It's getting to be a wage price type of pattern going up the stairs there. That being the case, I think we've got some more inflation coming here. and that those numbers in 2022 should still be pretty high as far as I can tell. That works into an election scenario, which a lot of people say that this is what will cause the Republicans to win the elections in House seats and in the Senate and take control of the Senate and the House. If that happens, there'll be a very big change in the US. And then you'll be on the presidential sweep. And I would not like to be a Democrat following the 2022 elections if they go as sort of as I think they are.
All right, Dr. Laffer, we of course want to be respectful of your time. Do you happen to have time for one more question?
Of course, I'm here for you guys. I love this company. As you know, Empo, I love Bill McDonald. I really think he's one of the heroes of the planet. And this idea of myfinancialcoach.com or whatever it is just a phenomenal use of resources. It's a great way for people to get high quality inputs, a much more economically feasibly way. So I'm a huge fan. And as you know, I think I'm the, Bill, I don't know if I am or not, but the largest owner, second largest owner. I'm the largest owner next to you in my coach. And I just love the company and I love what you do. And every time I hear the special experts, I'm just blown away. The two of them today, I mean, Todd and Lamar were just great. And I just listening with bated breath. I can't believe, I mean, it's really neat stuff you guys provide.
All right. Well, this is sort of the last question that we have for you today before we let you go. As you know, there is sort of the other flip side of the coin from not just the monetary policy side of things, but with the pandemic and the argument that there was a lot of pent-up demand, supply chain bottlenecks, and things of that nature. Would you say that is also part of why the conversation is tilted more towards, hey, this is transitory, temporary, as opposed to this being more of a fixed fixture and it's just going to continue to happen? So I turn it to you.
Yeah, let me just say, that's a very good argument until you start looking at the recent data. And what you found is the participation rate at the end of Clinton, I forget what it was exactly, was 66, 67%. And during the whole period of W, it went down. And then all the period of Obama, it went down to where at the beginning, I think at the beginning of it rose a little bit during Trump there. And I think at the beginning of the pandemic, Empo, it was somewhere about 63, 64%, somewhere in that range. And since then, it has dropped down to 61%. Now, when the recent pandemic, when it popped back up again, it popped up very sharply to about 61.5%. And then it's flattened out for the last 8 months. It's flattened out. There is no sign of that participation rate rising. All the monthly indicators, et cetera. If you look at the gap between GDP trended after before the pandemic, let's say in February, and then you get the big catch up there, and then the trend going forward, it's not closing that gap. The third quarter GDP growth was 2%. That's not good in any way, shape, or form. That's not a catch up. That's just plain not. So when I look at these numbers, I find that the change in the employment for people because of the transfers, because of their wealth, you're finding people not wanting to go back to work, and they're not going to go back to work. Now, once they've been unemployed for 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 months, a year or two, they lose the skills, the requisite skills to be good at their jobs, and all of that stuff. And then they become less effective if they do go back to work. So I view this as being, if it is transitory, it's transitory in a 5-year level, not transitory in a 6-month level. And I just don't see any incentives yet for anyone being put back to work. These guys, net household wealth, if you look at the Federal Reserve's net wealth of the US, net household wealth is just huge. It's gone way up because all of these transfer payments have gone directly into the balance sheets of the companies and the poor, people who've received them. So, I don't see any reason why these people who hate their jobs will be wanting to go back now. I just don't see why they'd want to be a school bus driver. School bus driving is the worst job in the world. Why would anyone do it? Well, the only reason you do it is to make money. Why would you want to do some of these other jobs? You know what they are. And there's just no incentive for them to go back as long as they're being paid by the government not to work.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Laffer, for your thoughts. Bill,
Thanks,
I
Bill.
will transfer it to you for closing thoughts.
Well, thank you, Dr. Laffer. And for those of you on the call today or listening to the recording, you can download 3 chapters from Dr. Laffer's book coming out first quarter from myfinancialcoach.com under My Financial Coach University. We have 3 chapters up on the website that you can download and read and give us some input on it. But I think you'll really enjoy it. It's the history. I've heard, this history from Dr. Laffer before, and it is quite compelling. The data is there, and people say history repeats itself. Hopefully not. But thank you, Dr. Laffer, and thank you all for joining us today.